Impact Evaluation in Development Cooperation. My name is Kim Forss, and I'm one of the members of the Swedish expert group for aid evaluation. We are a public committee that was created 4 years ago. We have been in operation for 4 years, and it's a committee consisting of 10 members, and the chair of the committee is Helena Lindholm, who is Prorector of Gothenburg University and also a professor in peace and conflict research there. We are 10 persons in the committee, and we come from different walks of life. Some of us from evaluation research, and others from other sectors and with other fields of expertise. But our role in the committee is to initiate different types of studies that relate to Swedish development cooperation and to policy analysis, policy evaluation, and overviews, synthesis studies of results of processes of working, etc. We also have a secretariat consisting of 7 persons. Gustav Pettersson is the head of the secretariat, sitting there. And it is the secretariat that actually then make things happen. We take various initiatives in the committee, but for those then to boil down to studies being implemented, it's the secretariat that does the work. And then we work on the principle of double independence. So in a way, I lie when I say that the secretariat does the work. They don't, but they commission the studies. So then there's someone else who actually do the studies and the analysis. And they are then independent of us, so we try to keep a relative light touch on it so that the authors have full ownership of the research processes they are engaged in. And we in the committee and the secretariat were independent of the government. So hence the double independence that we like to talk about. It's not we who have invented it. In the past, there had been the ESO, the Expertgruppen i offentlig ekonomi, which worked under the Ministry of Finance and had worked on these principles for many years. And we are set up with basically the same idea on how to operate. Now, in those 4 years, we have produced, and we aim to produce, around 10 to 12 different studies a year, and that's a mixed bag. Some of it is clear-cut, straightforward evaluations, and other things are policy overviews, policy analysis. We have, for example, looked at the role of setting aside 1% for development cooperation and what impact that has on the whole debate on aid and the practice of aid. We have looked at the issues of democratic governance. We have done synthesis studies of results in the environmental field, in education, in the connection between humanitarian assistance and long-term development work, to name a few examples. But we have also commissioned a series of studies of how to find out about impact. And to date, we have had 3 such studies. And the first one we did at all was this one on randomized control trials and how one could use that approach in development cooperation. And it was Olofsgård who did that. That was the first study we ever did. And that was soon followed by another study done by Befani, which is on the method called Qualitative Comparative Analysis. That is here. And then recently, about a month ago, this study done by Ann-Sofie Isaksson on geospatial analysis of aid as an approach to aid impact evaluation was completed. Now, these are all slightly different. It's different methods, it's different types of studies, but they all are on the theme of how do you evaluate outcomes and impacts, what kind of approaches can you have. And we see that as our role in ABA, to not only to produce policy analysis and research, but also to serve the development evaluation community with knowledge and ideas on how to do that task, given that I think there are around 250 to 300 evaluations done every year in development cooperation, and we do 10 of those, 12 perhaps. So the other 240 need to be improved and could possibly benefit by the intellectual inputs on methodological approaches that we have produced here. These are all available out here, and EBA has a little table with other publications as well, just round the corner. You see a flag, an EBA flag there, and piles of books that will probably soon disappear. I should also tell you that in this session we will have introductions by the authors to these 3 reports. And after that, Barbara Befani will comment on differences, similarities between the 3 studies. So Barbara is in the double role of both presenting one of the reports and also on commenting a little bit on the others. Like we work on the principle of double independence, she works on the principle of double dependence. We have that statue, but she will do that in dialogue with the other authors, and then we open up for a general discussion about methodological issues. Yes, I should perhaps also say that this session is filmed, and EBA has a web page, www.eba.se, and where you can take part of the film if you want to afterwards. So we are film stars. Well, some kind.
Finally.
Anders, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. Right, so first of all, I feel I need to apologize for dragging you indoors on such a beautiful day. But at least you can see the view over there if you could put it looking at me. So as was already sort of told here, I mean, what I'm going to talk about today is basically based on this report that I wrote a couple of years ago. But, you know, I've been studying this topic a little bit after that as well, so I think I'm reasonably up to date. But in that particular study, if you're interested, it's available outside. There are basically 3 different things I do. I give a short introduction to the method with some leading examples, talk about some of the papers that have been influential in this literature and in this debate. I talk a bit about the different strengths and weaknesses of the approach. And then I have a more kind of in-depth discussion of the method's application in Swedish aid policy. But given the shortness of time and so on, I'm basically going to skip that 3rd part today and going to focus on the first 2 parts, give you a very simplistic kind of example of how to do an RCT that only captures a little bit about what can be done, obviously, in such a short time. But then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on talking on the different strengths and weaknesses. And then Barbara will fill in a little bit on the comparative perspective. But probably for many of you, the concept of a randomized controlled trial is most closely associated with drug trials, right? Much of the terminology that is used, even in the sort of areas where I work, which is development economics, is still, in a sense, taken from that literature and that tradition. We're talking about treatment groups and control groups and things like that. But actually, if you do a bit of a historical exploration of the use of these kind of methods, you would see that it actually dates back before that, even to the 19th century, when some psychologists and sociologists and so on were trying out methods along these lines. And I'm also going to say, when I talk about these selective strengths and limitation, I've done a slightly ad hoc way of trying to structure a discussion of the strengths and limitations along 3 different dimensions: a scientific dimension, what I refer to as a practical/ethical dimension, and then a resources finances dimension. And this is really ad hoc, and I made this up, but hopefully it makes some sense and can help you sort of understand these things a little bit more. So a simple example then to illustrate why to do an RCT and how it could be done. So think about someone interested in the question whether building solid, proper school buildings has an impact on students' learning. I mean, I'm a development economist, so think of rural Uganda or something. In some villages, maybe, schools or teaching are taking place under, a tree, basically. You don't have a proper house. But if you have a proper house, maybe you have electricity, maybe you have other opportunities to, basically do better teaching in many different ways. Then the question is, how should we evaluate whether building schools buildings does have an impact on student learning? Okay? And then, of course, the first thing you may ask yourself is, why can't we just go out and collect some data? I mean, in some villages they do have school buildings, in others they don't. Why can't we just look at national test scores and compare them across villages or schools where they have buildings with those where they don't? And look at, differences in average or something like that. Well, a reason for why that may not really work in terms of identifying the causal impact of the school building is that there may be a lot of different other things that also influence student learning. And some of these things may systematically vary with the likelihood that you have a school building in your village. For instance, maybe it's more likely that you do have a proper school building in a more affluent village. That kind of makes sense, right? Both for economic and political reasons. But in a more affluent village, children are probably better nourished as well. They may have parents who value education more. There may be less of a demand on their time for different kind of household, tasks and things like that. So there may be many good reasons to believe that in a better off village, students may do better academically, also for other reasons, right? So if you just do this kind of comparison in this perspective, then you're going to kind of associate the positive effect from affluence to the effect of better school buildings, and you will tend to have a sort of positive bias in terms of the estimated effect of the school buildings, right? So this is a kind of selection issue here, right? You can make a similar argument about if you have better schools, better buildings, you're going to be able to attract better teachers because it's, it's better, more pleasant to teach in a village with a proper school. Maybe if school children are mobile as well across schools, the more motivated parents are going to send their children to the proper school buildings, right? So once again, kind of a positive selection problem. On the other hand, you may also think of a negative selection problem in case aid donors or governments are particularly targeting particularly poor and vulnerable communities to make investments in school buildings. Either way, there's a risk of kind of selection bias in different directions. Well, if you think about it a little bit more thoroughly, you may, and you know a little bit about sort of research methodology and so on, you may ask them, but well, what if I'm able to actually measure differences in these schools before and after you're building them? Shouldn't that solve the problem then? It definitely helps a lot, so-called difference in difference. But on the other hand, it still requires that the time trends are the same in these two different types of villages. And maybe in a better off village, the development in that village generally is more on a positive spin than in a poorer village, and therefore also the time trends are different. It may also be the case that the complementarity of school buildings relative to other inputs to the production of knowledge among children is different depending on the different kind of facilities you have around as well. And if these also co-vary with income and things like that, you're also going to have an issue in terms of heterogeneous treatment effects and things like that. Okay? So it helps, but it doesn't solve the whole problem. So if I say then that randomized controlled trials not perhaps always solve the whole problem, but at least gets a way towards it, what does a randomized controlled trial in a context like this do then? Well, the method basically implies that what you're supposed to do is that you should select a sample of villages where at this point you do not have any school buildings, okay? And then you decide to treat, roughly half of these villages as what we refer to as treatment villages, and half of them as control villages. And you want to make sure that these different villages are roughly similar. So if there's a lot of heterogeneity among many dimensions that you think may matter for learning, you may need to stratify the data according to some different dimensions and put these different schools in groups and choose within those different groups. But the main point is that among these sample of schools or villages you're talking about, you need to randomly pick which of them are going to be treatment schools and which of them are going to be control schools. Okay? So you're not selecting based on something, you're not letting politicians influence who you should choose or an NGO influence who you should choose. It has to be randomly. Okay? But then prior to actually entering into the villages and starting building these schools, you need to take what is referred to as a baseline. So a baseline is basically a first test before the intervention is implemented of the status within these villages. So if you have national test scores, look at national test scores. If not, do your own test of children in the villages and see what level of skills they have. Okay? In addition to that, you should also generally collect a set of other observation or information about potential confounding factors that may also influence learning and bias your results so that you can make sure, first of all, that the two different groups, treatment and control groups, are similar, roughly. And secondly, if you put this into a multivariate regression framework, you can control for some of these potentially confounding factors as well. But the first thing, as I point out here, is that with this baseline data, you create a so-called balance test or a balance table, which kind of is a way of testing that your randomization has worked, in the sense that the distributions along these different dimensions that may also matter, say household income, say education of parents, whatever we're talking about, are roughly similar in these two different groups of villages then. Then you do your intervention, you build your schools, right? Only in the treatment schools, not in the control schools or villages, obviously. And then after appropriate time, and what is appropriate time then depends on the type of intervention. If we're talking about building schools, obviously we don't think that this is going to kickstart, students learning in a week or two, so we need to wait a year or 2 or 3 or whatever we think is appropriate. But then after that appropriate time, you go back to the villages, both treatment and control villages, you collect new information, what is referred to as the end line, on student learning and these different confounding factors, and potentially some other variables you may have put in there in order to be able to identify different mechanisms and things like that. So I mean, you can make it a lot more complicated, but I'm not going to go into this at this case. Now you have baseline data before the intervention in both treatment and control villages. You have end-line data in both treatment and control villages. And then you can, in the simplest case, when everything is kind of working in a sense, you can basically calculate the average treatment effect by looking at the estimated difference in the progress of learning or knowledge of children in the treatment schools on average compared to those in the control schools on average. So the differences in the means is our measure of the average treatment effect. Okay? And given the idea then that by randomizing this, we're creating the counterfactual in the control group of what the effect would have been in the treatment group if they had not gotten the intervention, we think of this as a causal effect. And we also, according to theory, think of this as an effect not only for the sample, but for the underlying population. So that's kind of a little bit the theory underlying the argument, that we're capturing a causal effect and that we can translate it to the population. Okay, so strengths and weaknesses then. And this is a kind of selective set of strengths and weaknesses. I mean, people have been arguing a lot about these different things, so I'm sure there are many others as well. 3 minutes, okay. So I have to do this even quicker then. So in terms of scientific strengths, I mean, the big thing about this has to do with sort of internal validity. There are people arguing and bickering about the details about this, but I'm not going to go into that. But clearly a big reason for why you see a lot of this method being applied has to do with the relative strength in terms of internal validity. Another thing I want to argue for as well is that it also, compared to many other methods, gives the researcher quite a bit of control of what to measure, and it also imposes, for policy purposes, quite a bit of discipline when you're planning an intervention. So when I wrote this report on applying this method in the area of foreign aid, one thing I really wanted to point out, and I think was a big advantage, was that when you're applying this method, you as an evaluator need to be involved at the early stage of planning an intervention. You're not just showing up after the fact that an intervention has been done and so on. And given the method, this means that when someone is planning an intervention, they have to be very clear about what they think the objectives of this intervention is. Okay? You can't be fussy about that, you have to be very clear about it. You also have to be very clear about how to measure impact. Okay? So you need to be clear about objective and how to measure it. And I think that kind of discipline into interventions more generally, in a context like foreign aid, for instance, is very valuable by itself. Also, control, because you are designing the survey instruments, so you can exactly decide what to ask for and so on, in many ways, right? You can't control how people are responding and how they're understanding the questions, but that's always the case whenever you do surveys, right? Weaknesses then, well, external validity is perhaps the most talked about, most well-known limitation with this method. I mean, because something works in, say, rural Uganda, that was the example I was giving, maybe the same intervention doesn't work at all if you try to do it in the slums in India or something like that, because the context is very different. And I can't really tell that most of the case, based on my study in Uganda. This also concerns not only in terms of place, but also in terms of who is doing this. There's some recent research now who are showing that, when you've had relatively small pilots being implemented by motivated NGOs, things seem to be working very well. When that is scaled up and taken instead by a government entity, the effect isn't there. So it's also a question about who is doing these things, right? And the scale, as I pointed out as well, I mean, it has an impact in that sense, but also in the sense that you can have negative general equilibrium effects or political economy considerations that come into place as well. Another weakness has to do with so-called case selection. So of course, if you're going to do something like this, you need to do it in cooperation with someone, often an NGO or a government, who's implementing an intervention. If you have so I'll try this very quickly then, and probably have to skip a few. But in terms of case selection then, I mean, if you have an NGO who's doing relatively well in the sense that they're receiving a lot of money, but they themselves realize that, what we're doing doesn't really make much of a difference. This NGO is not going to be very happy about you doing an RCT on their study, because that's what it's going to show. Instead, if you have an NGO who's very sure about that their particular intervention in their particular case is very positive, they are more likely to accept you to do an evaluation. So there's a bit of a selection in terms of which projects along a particular program are going to be evaluated or not. And narrow focus, well, let's skip that for now, because that's not really something that has to be there. In terms of practical and ethical things, I mean, in terms of logic, I think it's easy to understand the procedure. It doesn't rely on a ton of, semantics and concepts and stuff like that. It's relatively easy to see how it works, I think. On the other hand, many interventions cannot be randomized, right? Obviously. I mean, they're too big, they're too expensive and things like that. And it also, the fact that it requires early involvement also means that you can't come up with the idea of doing this ex post generally, unless if you do something called encouragement designs. And maybe, since we're running out of time, just two things then on ethics. This is also something that is discussed a lot. I think there are pros and cons. I think most of them are actually pros. First of all, it reduces the risk of political capture because you can't selectively choose where to implement something, in a sense, which is often the case. Also, I mean, I think it's been referred to as being experimental simply because we talk about it as being experimental. But in my view, whenever you implement some kind of intervention, the impact of which you don't know, and if you don't even have a plan for how to know whether it has an impact, you are experimenting. So if you're doing something that has built into it a system for actually learning whether it has an impact or not, to me that is less experimental in many ways. And then the final point on this page just has to do with resources and finances, okay? And this is a relatively expensive form of evaluation. There are even more expensive forms of scientific inquiry, as you can see there. But relative to many interventions that may be the alternative in these kind of circumstances is relatively expensive. It also takes quite a lot of time to get results, as the school building example pointed out and so on. And you need certain kind of quantitative skills to be able to do the analysis. But since I'm running out of time, I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fast talking towards the end.
I know.
Sorry for you, but thanks for trying to respect the time limit there. So next one, Barbara, and we take these studies in the order we have produced them. So that doesn't in any way reflect on how important the methods are, what potential they have, or whatever. It's just the way they were done. So Barbara, welcome. And you are at the University of East Anglia now. It usually
Surrey.
Surrey.
No, it's fellow at Surrey and associate at East Anglia.
So it wasn't totally wrong.
No.
Welcome anyway, and look forward to hearing.
Do I click this?
I think so, yes.
Okay, so the microphone works. Hello. Now opening presentation. Right, so I've been asked to talk about QCA, which stands for Qualitative Comparative Analysis, for about 13 minutes, trying to summarize strengths, weaknesses, and the policy relevance of it. But I would like to start with clearing out some misconceptions on causality and causal inference. And I'm not saying that you have these misconceptions, I don't know, but I know that they're not rare. I mean, it's quite, it's not difficult to find people who hold this misconception, so I'll just spend a couple of minutes on this, and then I'll go over impact evaluation questions, not just because it helps understand what QCA does, what the opportunities are, but also because it helps me. It's in a way an introduction to the other moment where I will compare the methods. So that's kind of important to say something about the different impact evaluation questions. And then instead of focusing on strengths and weaknesses, I'd like. Instead of focusing on strengths and weaknesses, I'd like to frame the issue in comparative advantages, or let's say advantages and opportunities, and requirements. I just don't like the idea of sort of weakness of the method. I think in my experience, most of the weakness, weakness is either something that is not offered by the method, so it's like if you say what is offered, you also know what is not offered. And also it's something related to requirements, to what the method needs to be feasible, to be applicable. So I'd rather frame this in terms of opportunities offered by the method and requirements. So here we are at the misconceptions. The first one, the main misconceptions that I would like to discuss is something that I've been hearing for years. You cannot establish causality unless you have a counterfactual. This is not true. So doing quasi-experiments or randomized controlled trials is not the only way to do causal inference and to do impact evaluation if you think that impact evaluation is about establishing causal inference. And there are at least 3 major models of causality and causal inference used not just in science, but also hard science and social science, but also in professional practice, everyday life, everywhere. So there's Mills methods, there's 5 sub-methods: method of difference, method of agreement, method of concomitant variation, and then the generative or mechanism-based causality and configurational causality, which is also known as multiple conjunctural causality. I'll say a bit more about this as we go along, because they are kind of quite clearly linked to types of impact questions that you can ask. But one of the problems with the misconceptions that you need a counterfactual to establish causality is that seeking rigorous methods, in this case, becomes reducing selection bias. So it's like nothing else is important as long as we reduce selection bias. So we have RCTs as the top, the gold standard, because they're the best at reducing selection bias. So again, it's true within a sort of narrow group of causal models, which are, in particular, one of the ways that we can sort of group them is seeing them as single cause models. But there's also multiple case causality models. By multiple case, I don't mean that there can be sort of multiple variables, because this is also true of various forms of regression analysis and macroeconomic models. And also the quasi-experiments take multiple variables into account. So this is not what I mean. I mean, by multiple causality, I mean models where causes are considered relevant as packages. So it's not just one cause that has like all the power to cause the effect, but it's like a combination of causes. And then I can isolate the role of single causes within the context and within the packages, but the basic unit of analysis is the package. And this is the type of causality that underpins, it's called configurational causality, and underpins QCA. So that's why it's relevant. So a little bit more on these different types of causal models. So in the generative causality, essentially we look at single cases and trying to understand details, like we try to answer the how and why questions, like how and why did this intervention work, what happened. So it's a model that requires a lot of detail about how the cause transitioned into the effect. In regression analysis and in sort of other methods based on concomitant variation, we focus on the additional contribution of a single variable to an outcome, but as if it were like a proportional increase. It's like topping up something that you're running out of. Whereas in configurational analysis, it's a bit like capturing chemical reactions, because you don't know in advance how the single factors are going to combine and the effect that they're going to have. So the same factor can have completely different consequences depending on which other factors it's combined with, and that's why it's called conjunctural, because depending on which other, on the context and on which other causes are acting or sort of being relevant in the unit of analysis, then you have a different effect. This is also the idea behind Inus causality, which maybe some of you have heard yesterday at the pre-sessions, some of the pre-sessions. And then another difference is that in this type of causality, it's not just about associating a cause with an effect. It's also about understanding whether the relation is of necessity or of sufficiency. So, is it like what is the nature of the causal relation? Is the cause necessary for the effect, or is it sufficient? It can be both. It can be neither. So yeah, this is something that not the other causal models don't address. And another thing is that some packages can be sufficient for an outcome, but not necessary. And this in practice means equifinality. So it means that you can have different ways of achieving the same results, so different recipes that work equally well. It's kind of a bit more complex than the other one, the Mills method. Right. So in terms of questions, impact evaluation questions. So as I was saying, this is relevant to understand not just what QCA can do, but also the differences between QCA and other methods. So if we take the overarching impact questions to be, did the intervention make a difference, then we can actually reformulate these questions in ways that are a bit more specific. One way is the famous net effect question. How much of a difference did the intervention make? And this is what we have seen in the previous presentation. This is the type of question that is answered by RCTs, quasi-experiments, and is based on Mills' method of difference and Mills' method of concomitant variation. But then a question that is equally interesting, or at least is increasingly interesting, is the how question. How did the intervention make a difference? So this is a question that can be answered with generative causality, mechanism-based causality. And there are various theory-based evaluation methods that can do that, like realist evaluation, contribution analysis, process tracing, and things like that. Finally, the question that is mainly answered by QCA, and by mainly I mean that QCA is ideally positioned to answer this kind of question, is what made a difference for whom and under what circumstances? Because different factors have a different relevance depending, as I was saying, on the context. And other ways of formulating this question are, was the intervention necessary for success, or were other factors necessary, or at least were they necessary under specific circumstances? Was the intervention itself sufficient? And if not, are there any successful combinations of factors that are sufficient for the effect? So other ways to sort of formulate the same questions that can be answered by QCA are the following. So what works for whom, under what circumstances, what makes a difference for the outcome where. And this is relevant for policy because it's not just an average. I'm not just trying to understand what the average effect or what the average situation looks like. I'm trying to understand sort of more precise, the situation in a sort of more precise, fine-grained, context-based way. So I'm trying to map the situation and see what it's like in different contexts and not just on average. And then what conditions are conducive to the outcome, which is relevant because, of course, policies want to encourage, facilitate, trigger change. But also what prevents the outcome from materializing? What conditions are required for the outcome to materialize? And this is interesting because we can be in a situation where everything else seems to work, but the outcome is not there and we don't understand why. Until we discover that there was some, necessary factor that was needed, that was required, and we didn't know it. So it might be important to know if there are any necessary conditions that can unlock outcomes or pave the way for outcomes to materialize, that are key ingredients that shouldn't be missing. Another way is which pathways combination recipes consistently work and which don't. So which are safe bets that we can invest on and which needs to be avoided. So maybe I'll skip this because I have 3 minutes. Don't remember how many slides. Okay, I'll go through this very quickly. I don't know how many of you know the difference or are familiar with these concepts of necessity and sufficiency, but they're key to QCA. Sufficient also means good enough, so it's like good enough to achieve the outcome, but at the same time not required, so it's sufficient but not necessary. While necessary but not sufficient means that it's required, but at the same time it's not good enough in itself, on its own. So there are other number of cooking metaphors that can be constructed, but I'll skip this. So in sum, QCA does not measure net effects, does not necessarily isolate the contribution of one intervention. It does it sometimes, but only in the context of a number of other things. Seeks to identify successful combination of factors. Seeks to understand which factors made a difference under what circumstances, rather than on average and in general. And also it's qualitative, so works with qualitative constructs, and is comparative and systematic. Synthesizes information rigorously across a set of cases and allows for different types of generalization. In other words, if calibration is done properly, and maybe we can see what was calibration later, probably we won't have time, it's replicable. So replicability or transparency is one dimension of quality, of research quality and also evaluation quality, but it's also reliable or stable. So if I use the same protocols and the same research, let's say if I sort of replicate the research in the same way, then I get the same findings. So the findings are stable. It's also externally valid. It's kind of relatively strong on external validity if the set of cases is representative of a broader population. If not, at least allows for a limited generalization on the data that you have. So it's definitely a tool to synthesize data sets when you are trying to use these data sets to answer the previous input questions. Perhaps the major weakness is construct validity, but it's still not worse than quasi-experiments and quantitative method. Actually, slightly better because it's qualitative. But for internal validity, it needs to be complemented with theoretical expertise or TBA methods. So very quickly on the requirements, I would say that it's not a strict requirement, but because it's a cross-case systematic comparison method, then it doesn't make any sense to use it on 1 or 2 cases, maybe even 3. So yeah, at least 5 or 6 cases, but maybe more. And the cases, this is possibly the strongest requirement. The cases need to be comparable, and this is sometimes not very easy to have. And And the other requirements is that, of course, you need someone who can do it, like some basic technical skills and understanding of set theory, which is not always to be taken for granted, and an expert of the substantive field to create the models, but also to make sense of the findings. Yeah, and that's it, I guess. Okay.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you also for keeping the time. I was a little bit worried there towards the end when you spoke about inner conditions and so on, but then it was fine. I should also perhaps mention that in this session we are giving an introduction to the different methods and we talk about their strengths and weakness, and so do the reports, except for Barbara's, which is a lot thicker than the others, and that's because it also has detailed instructions on how to work with the method. So you can actually take this, read it, and go out and do the QCA, and that's of course an advantage. Thanks and welcome, Sophia, and we look forward to hearing the next session here on the geospatial analysis and also the most recent of our reports.
Thank you.
So, thank you very much and welcome from Gothenburg.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm Ann-Sofie, I'm from the University of Gothenburg. So now we've gotten to the third impact evaluation method, GIE. There's a lot of abbreviations to keep track of for you guys, but GIE stands for Geospatial Impact Evaluation. And the reason I'm here, as you've already mentioned, is that I've just written a report on geospatial, the analysis of aid, a new approach to aid evaluation. And you can pick up a copy just outside this room if you're interested afterwards. Okay, so to begin with, what is geospatial impact evaluation? Well, as the name kind of implies, it uses geospatial data or geocoded data of where projects are located and combines this with geocoded data on outcomes. So when we say geocoded project data, we simply refer to where a project is located, so where it is implemented, could be one or many project sites. And when we talk about geocoded outcome data or results, it could be, for instance, a survey data where you have quite detailed knowledge of where the survey respondents live. So maybe not at the district level, but rather at the village level, for example. So you can connect them to projects in a quite detailed manner. Or it could be, for instance, satellite data, where you also have interesting results that could be connected to projects. So combining these data sources makes it possible to evaluate local effects of development projects. I speak of development projects because my focus has been on aid, but it might as well be other policies or investments even, or events that you're interested in evaluating. And it allows you to do so systematically and on a wide scale, perhaps even across several countries simultaneously. So the focus is on subnational variation, so comparing specific localities within countries that are targeted by a project to areas that are not targeted by a project. So in this way, this approach is a kind of a middle way between looking at performance at the national level, so country level outcomes, and looking at the very micro level, at evaluating an individual intervention, as was described by Anders in the randomized controlled trials. So I don't know how well you can see this, I realize, but this is an example from my own research of how to combine geocoded outcome and project data. So the red dots are Chinese aid projects in Africa, and the green dots are Afrobarometer areas covered by the Afrobarometer, which is a large-scale survey project. It focuses on democratic attitudes and behaviors and so on. It contains a lot of information, but we focused on experiences with corruption in this particular paper. So what we did was that we identified survey respondents who live close to a Chinese project, So we chose the cutoff 50 kilometers, but that's of course arbitrary. You can define that yourself. And then we compared people living close to a Chinese project that had not yet started at the time the Afrobarometer survey covered that particular area, to people living close to a project that had actually started when the survey covered that particular area, and looked at corruption experiences in these two groups, and finding then that you see significantly more corruption in areas where the Chinese project has actually started implementing. Kind of suggesting that Chinese aid projects fuel local corruption. So here we obviously look at an unintended consequence of aid projects, so an undesirable consequence of aid projects, but you might as well, look into whether a project achieves its intended objectives. So it could, for instance, be, if a project aims to raise awareness about HIV, do they really manage to do that in those particular areas? There's survey data that can use to look into these kinds of questions. So in recent years, there's been a rapid increase in the availability of geocoded data. And this is both on the project side and on the results side or the outcome side. So for aid specifically that we focus on, the World Bank has been a forerunner, for instance. They now geocode all their aid projects. And the African Development Bank and the Asian Development Bank also does so to a great extent. And also some aid-receiving countries geocode incoming aid flows themselves. So you have data on where the aid projects are actually implemented within the country. And also due to, I would say, partly due to improved technology, you have increased access to geocoded results data. You could, for instance, look at satellite images, have been used to study deforestation, for example, and you could use data from mobile phone, internet use, credit card use to look at consumption patterns on a detailed local level as well, and connect that to projects carried out in the particular area. And as I already mentioned, there are these big survey projects like the Afrobarometer, the Demographic and Health Survey, for instance, the World Bank Living Measurements, or mix up the name. But there are a bunch of surveys that now geocode to a quite detailed level. So rather than providing information on, say, the district level, they now provide information on the, say, the village level where the respondents live. So as a result, there's been an increase in the number of studies using this type of data. So on the aid side, we have a bunch of studies coming out in the last couple of years, looking at the effects of aid on local conflict, health aid on health outcomes, on corruption, on environmental impacts. I mentioned deforestation, for instance, on gender-related outcomes, for instance, domestic violence by Anders and his co-authors. So and this is just in the last couple of years. So I think there's a lot of things going on in this field. So what are the strengths of this approach? And I realize when listening to Anders' presentation that you can kind of relate it to the strengths and weaknesses of RCT to a great extent. So I would say that GIE is a good option when you have large-scale quantitative data for interventions that are not randomly allocated. So in lack of randomized data, this could be a good alternative for quantitative analysis. We already discussed the selection issues involved, so maybe that's not anything I need to get into. But the thing here is that when you have quite or very local information about where the project is implemented and about results, you can control for confounding factors at a local level, which is of course a good thing. So we can use what can be called quasi-experimental methods. So you don't have a treatment and control group in the strict sense that you described, but you can try to find something similar. So if you call people who are actually reached by a project, the treated group, you can try to find an as comparable group as possible as a control group, controlling for confounding factors at the local level, and try to look at developments over time. So in a way, it's in terms of quantitative analysis, it's the second best, I guess, after randomized controlled trials. But the reality is that for most interventions, we don't have randomized data, right? So it's a good option in those cases. It's also relatively strong in terms of generalizability or external validity. You can look at several projects at once across several countries if you want to. And you also often have results data that cover a long period of time. For instance, if you have satellite images from going far back in time before the intervention to going, to the present day. So you don't have to do the baseline and the end line, but you can actually look at long data records over time. And I guess this is not a minor point, this last one, that is relatively cost effective, since you can draw on existing data materials to quite a large extent. This data on geocoded outcome data tends to be publicly available for anyone to use. So that is of course a major advantage. You don't have to do all the data collection yourself. So any student or evaluator could actually get access to this data quickly. The limitations are also quite obvious. It's not appropriate for all types of development projects. You need a well-defined project site. Some projects obviously don't have that. You could think of budget support in an aid context, for instance, or debt relief agreements. Money that is distributed at the more aggregate level or at the national level even. In terms of the aid data, there are gaps in the data at this point. Far from all donors geocode their aid, so it's hard to get an overview of all aid projects in a particular area. And the questions you can ask are limited by what's in the outcome data out there, if you're not intending to collect data yourself. So when it's appropriate to use follows, clearly from these pros and cons. It's appropriate to use when you have well-defined local project sites and subnational variation in project coverage, when there is relevant geocoded outcome data, and it's not appropriate to use when you don't have these things, right? So I was looking a bit into the potential for using geospatial impact evaluation for Swedish aid evaluation. And here the first thing to note is that Swedish aid is not yet geocoded on a wide scale. So a first step would be to look into what information is actually already out there. Since some aid-receiving countries geocode their projects themselves, you can pick up some information from that, and also from donors that you co-fund projects with, such as the World Bank. And if you decide to proceed with geocoding, there are different options that are not mutually exclusive. You could hire coders to geocode the entire portfolio. That's one alternative, or you could look into specific projects in more detail. That's another one. Or provide support to partner country initiatives who want to geocode the incoming aid flows themselves, but have capacity constraints in doing so. So this has been about aid, but it's of course applicable in other contexts too. You can think of any project or policy or event that can be connected to a local project site, and where you have subnational variation in project coverage. A potential example in Sweden could be the EU regional support funds that Marcus mentioned to me. You can also think, I don't know, I haven't digged into very much to what extent there is access to geocoded outcome data in Sweden, but I know that Statistics Sweden provides access to at least some geocoded data on demographics, socioeconomic conditions, and school performance, and so on. And also the data sources I just described on, information from mobile phone use, internet credit card use, satellite images, and so on, they are of course applicable in the Swedish context as well. So in sum, I would say that geospatial impact evaluation is a fruitful approach when you're interested in projects implemented in a clearly defined geographical area. And it constitutes kind of a middle way between the national level evaluations and the and the evaluations of individual projects that are good for, in terms of external validity, if you want to get a sense of how this works on a wider scale. And with this rapid increase in the availability of geocoded data that is often publicly available, I think it would be kind of wasteful actually not to make use of it, because it offers great opportunities for cost-effective evaluation, I would say. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ann-Sofie, and thank you also for mentioning that word cost-effective evaluation, which we seldom hear, but which is so important for good evaluation. Not only does it need to be trustworthy and ethically correct and so, but also cost-effective, and to make good use of data, outcome data, which there is, of course, extremely important too. As we are doing well in terms of time with all the presenters here, we proceed as planned, meaning that, Barbara, we would invite you again to reflect on the studies. That's your position as having traveled the longest to come here to reflect a little bit on your own and the other studies, and of course then also to engage in a little bit of dialogue with Ann-Sofie and Anders.
Yeah.
Okay.
Understand the logic. So yeah, it's this one. So I will remember to do this now. Okay, so first of all, I'm not an expert of all three methods, and actually I've heard about RCTs for a long time. I've read a lot of things about RCTs, but I'm very new to GIE. So, you know, maybe what I say needs to be taken with a grain of salt, and I hope that both my colleagues will give me some feedback at the end. Anyway, so while I was thinking about, I've thought about the similarities and differences between RCTs and QCA for a long time, but of course, being GIE new, I've been doing some thinking on the same issue, including that method. So I've come up with a list of similarities and differences. Maybe they're not very well structured, but this is what I will say at the beginning. And then I tried to think, what if we combine this method? So, you know, it's three methods, and we have three possible combinations, I think, if I'm not wrong. And then I thought, you know, what would happen if we combine them? And then just some concluding remarks. So, yeah, so in terms of similarities and differences that I could think of, so to me, GIE seems to be more like a way to structure the available data and to make more data available at like a local level, like at a disaggregated specific level. But I wasn't sure that it in itself can be called an IE design, or I don't know, maybe a method. So the first thing that to strike me was it provides data that can be used very easily and fruitfully with some quasi experiments. For example, difference in differences. But in order to call it like a design or a method, I think it needs to be combined or used in the context of some other IE design, like, for example, quasi experiments. While I would say that RCTs and QCA are more like self-standing, it's not the right word, but anyway, are more like IE designs or methods in themselves, or at least they don't focus so much on data collection. Well, RCTs is in a way is not even just an evaluation designs, because it affects program implementation, so by controlling exposure, and QCA is usually part of a multi-method design. But for example, QCA doesn't really tell you how to collect data, while GIE is very much into, which data we need to collect and how do we process the data, what information we add, and so on. So I would say, if I can maybe simplify, forgive me about the simplifications, I would say that GIE maybe focuses on data collection and organization. RCTs focuses on controlling exposure to the intervention. QCA focuses on data organization and structuring, but mostly on data analysis and synthesis. And I would say that there's a big difference in the, well, okay, it's a similarity. There's a similarity between RCTs and GIE in I think they answer the same impact question, which is the net effect question. So how much of a difference did the intervention make? And they both, I think, clearly aim to eliminate selection bias, or at least reduce selection bias. RCT is by design, and GIE, it can be used in situations where randomization is not possible. So I think they're both very good at that. Can they be combined? So, I think, yeah, in theory, yes, they can. For example, we've heard about realist RCTs, which is some kind of doing multiple RCTs in different contexts and then trying to understand why if the effects are different. But this is, if one RCT is expensive, then multiple RCTs are like n times as expensive. So that could be a problem. But in theory, you can combine, you can do the same thing, with QCA, and you can sort of convert net effects from multiple RCTs to outcome conditions in QCA, and then do some kind of comparative analysis with a QCA model. Then I think that in terms of combinations between GIE and QCA, GIE seems like an excellent way of collecting both specific and rich data over geographical areas, and it can definitely be useful for QCA, especially since QCA is quite sensitive to missing data. So I think it can expand the analytical possibilities of QCA a lot. It can, specifically, it can allow for the testing of additional models, additional QCA models that you wouldn't be able to test without that kind of data, or the same models over a larger number of cases. So, yeah, it could make new types of data available and increase the number of cases with fully available data, and definitely QCA can only benefit from something like that. I don't know if RCTs and GIE can be combined. Sorry, I don't know GIE well enough to say this. Yeah, so in synthesis, I think GIE could definitely both improve and expand the application of QCA, but also quasi-experiments. And I would say that in general, more data and higher quality data are always welcome. But in terms of designs and purposes, QCA and RCTs sort of couldn't be any more different, because they answer different questions in different ways, and combining them would be sort of cumbersome and expensive because they're so different. And also, RCTs are weak on external validity, while both QCA and GIE seem to be much stronger on external validity. And yeah, and that's it, basically. That's the comments I have.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Thank you.
We all come to
Great.
the stage.
Yes. Why don't you all three come up and exchange some views on this, and then we'll hear from the audience as well. Shall I give you a quick opportunity to respond, Ann-Sofie and Anders, on Barbara's ideas, and maybe you have our answers to her hypothesis about what can and cannot be combined, and
yeah, maybe a little bit.
Maybe a little bit, yes.
The first thought was if GIE is a method. No, maybe it should be seen more of as an approach. We were discussing this actually in when writing the report. It's a way of using a particular type of data, and you can combine it with different types of methods. So yeah, an approach is probably a better word. If GIE, the focus is on data collection, I don't know, but still, we're still in Sweden at least, we're still in the process of, collecting the necessary data to be able to carry this type of analysis out in the context of aid. So maybe that's why it comes across as focus is on data collection, because I focus on, Swedish potential for data collection in the field. But it's, I would say, a way of using existing data rather that is out there, but that I also touched upon. How you can combine them. I think GIE and RCTs could actually be combined, or at least you could use geospatial data to kind of make an informed decision about where to conduct RCTs, perhaps, in what areas are, certain types of aid is directed to, for instance. And you can use complementary data on the local level to control for factors that you might be interested in, perhaps, in this, I don't know, when you're designing your RCT. I haven't given that much thought, though, but that's my first kind of idea. I am not very familiar with the QCA, I must admit, but it seems like a good way to also dig into the mechanisms. But since that's kind of a problem when you sit with these types of investigations, you kind of get a black box. You see an effect, or you don't see an effect, but why? So that's something that could benefit from, complement each other, I think. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, Anders.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you very much. Yeah, well, first, just since you were asking about complementarity, I can see how geospatial impact evaluation can be a way of testing external validity of RCTs as well. I mean, if you have an RCT of a particular type of intervention in one context, and you, through geospatial data, can identify that intervention in other places as well, you can do a geospatial analysis to see, on average, does it seem to have an impact also in other contexts. So
yeah, that's true.
That, to me, would be a nice way of kind of combining the methods for understanding more on the weak side of RCTs with respect to external validity and so on. And I mean, in terms of relative merits of different methods and so on, I mean, I think it's important to point out that, when I was given the example here is the simplest possible example of how to apply an RCT, and we're looking at net effects. But of course, in reality, we're not only looking at net effects, we're looking at a lot of different ways. I think in many ways is a distinction in terms of the terminology we're using. I mean, we're potentially allowing for heterogeneous treatment effects with different kind of interaction effects in multivariate regression. That's a common way of dealing with what you probably refer to as conjectural effects or something like that. And I mean, also, I mean...
That's a misconception.
Yeah, I mean, there's many ways of framing these things. And I mean, many times why people doing quantitative analysis may be more reluctant to look into these kind of differential impact has to do with sort of statistical power, since we take, statistical power seriously. And I mean, I don't really know how you deal with that, because I wasn't really clear what QCA actually does, to be honest, and how you deal with that kind of issues when you're trying to, differentiate between, the effect of different variables and in different samples and things like that. So I think, I mean, difference between quantitative and qualitative is obviously quite important, and how you kind of take that seriously, sample sizes and things like that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And maybe we should open up for a few questions from you in the audience. Yes, Evert.
He shot 70 people on an island outside Oslo, and he is in jail for life, probably.
21 years.
And it seems to me that the process that we use in court is similar to process tracing, with just one case. There is no counterfactual case in the court. It's just the case of being Brady. You follow him in his tracks and so on, in order to find out the mechanism. What is your opinion of that?
Yes, I completely agree with you.
Did everyone hear the question?
Yeah.
Good, fine.
Yes, so I'll answer the second one first. I completely agree with you. So process tracing is based on generative causality, and it describes the mechanism essentially as a process. And there's a logic for causal inference and causal attribution, if you want, is used in law courts, for example. It's also used in crime investigation, in medical diagnosis. The aim is to find evidence that shows the existence of one mechanism, because the mechanism is like an ontological entity. It's like the description of a reality which could exist or could not exist. We don't know it unless we observe it, like, you know, while it's developing, while it's taking place. We don't know if it happened or it didn't happen. So what we do is we find, with process tracing, we find evidence that that thing that we think happened actually happened. So I don't know if this is kind of a good description of what a mechanism is, but it's definitely the ontological level. And what I like about process tracing is that it operates this clear distinction between the ontological level and the empirical level, and then uses the empirical level to change our confidence in the existence of the ontological object. Sorry if that's too...
I was just going to say that I would ask Ivo if he is happy with the question, because I know that he has a follow-up question. However,
It seems to me that it has to do with intentions, and political scientists are very interested in intentions. What was his intention in this system? I mean,
Yeah, exactly.
Which you have in mind, which you can see,
Exactly, yeah.
which you are interested in.
Exactly, because it's unobservable. That's the problem. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. No, I was actually, since the theme is complexity, and I was thinking about Ray Paulson's lecture this morning, it was quite interesting to hear if you had any reflections, because I thought I heard him saying that complexity is too great to actually establish external validity or replicability of a project from one place to another, because of the 7 different aspects he was mentioning. So I think it probably is more connected to QCA, the realist evaluation approach, but to RCTs in particular, he seemed to be a bit critical. And yeah, it was just interesting to hear reflections on that.
Anders, I don't think you were here with the
No, I don't know what it's about. Sorry, no idea.
Were you on something?
Yeah, so maybe I can say something just because I can shut up. But no, first maybe that's a misconception. But the when I mentioned replicability at some point, I wasn't referring to programs. I was referring to the application of the method. So it's like, you know, if the method is applicable, is repeated, if the application is repeated to the same object, you know, or the application of the method can be repeated. So it was kind of because one thing is the replicability of the method, and another thing is the replicability of the intervention. So I just wanted to sort of clarify that. I don't really have other comments on.
One more question. Shall we take one more question before we break for coffee?
Okay. Actually, on the same theme, complexity. Actually, on the same theme, complexity here. But overall, it seems that the 3 methods deal with complexity in 3 quite different ways. The challenge of complexity would be interesting just to hear from each one of you a bit how these methods deal with the challenge of complexity, including some pros and cons, if it's possible to do it short.
Is it?
Can you explain exactly what is meant with complexity in this particular? So that it's typically when you have an outcome, it's not only one factor that is contributed to that outcome, or is it more about external validity? Yeah. Somebody want to start?
Well, I mean, I think, as you were kind of touching upon before, that it's a bit to do with semantics, how how we express things differently, maybe from a quantitative angle and a qualitative angle. I would say that the qualitative approaches, of course, you know, they're better able to give a detailed account of, you know, mechanisms, theoretical mechanisms involved, and why and how questions. Whereas GIE, in particular, then can kind of paint the broad picture, give you a sense of average patterns, so to speak. But what you can do is, as you were saying, you can dig into interactive effects between how different variables interact. And now we were into the quantitative lingo again, but it's kind of a way to approach these issues from that side. And you can also explore heterogeneity, as you like to call it, you know, looking into how a certain effect shows up differently in different contexts. You can explore that if you have the statistical power to do so. So I guess, you know, you can explore how it's not only that you get like an average effect, you can actually look into how this looks in a particular country and in a particular area in a country, and how different factors interact and so on. But to get a deeper account and a deeper understanding, of course, it's a good idea to dig into the actual accounts of the qualitative accounts. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, shall I answer this, or have I spoken too much? No, okay. So just briefly, the causality that underpins QCA is also, I mean, some people call it complex causality. Others say it's not enough complex, but yeah, some people say. And the complexity lies in the fact that causes behave in different ways depending on what happens. So, for example, one way that can be used is to monitor system states and try to understand, like, for example, what tips systems from one state to another, or from one attractor to another, which is relatively unpredictable, but you still can monitor system states and then make sense of it later with these techniques.
Thank you all, and I think thereby we put an end to this discussion, and I think we from EBA are quite happy because we have added to the complexity of aid evaluation. It's no longer one method, but at least three, and many things to consider when you make the methodological choices. And considering that we do some 250 to 300 evaluations of development every year, out of which 60, 70, 80 from SIDA, we do 10 in EBA, and then others in the civil society, research and academic worlds. There's a lot of scope for having sophisticated methodological choices, and I would say that it's probably less than 10% of those that apply either of these methods or approaches to data collection that we see here. So there's a lot of scope to develop the thinking around methods and the choice of methods. And on that happy note we end, and thank you very much for coming.